Today we're talking about some of the most hyped video games there's ever been. But what do we mean by hype video games? Well, these are the games that are perhaps just a little more over the top, pumping up your adrenaline and giving you plenty of those holy shit moments. In the back of your mind, I want you all to think of games that you'd add to this list, but getting right into it, some of the first games I want to talk about are the Marvel vs. Capcom games. There's a whole bunch of them, and the ones I own are a few of my personal favorites. Now, these were actually the inspiration for this topic, and it's pretty easy to understand why. These games are all about throwing together a bunch of our favorite characters and letting us fight it out in tag team matches with fast gameplay, crazy combos, and some really over-the-top special moves. These games can actually be a little overwhelming for people who aren't used to them, and understandably so. However, they make it a little easier to pull off special moves, and you can always button mash your way into some combos. Of course, you'll have more fun if you know what you're doing, but my point is just that the gameplay can still be exciting if you don't. One of the things that really benefits these games is just how fluid and detailed so many of the animations are. Combine that with how fast everything moves, and it really is a visual spectacle. The next game I want to talk about is Gunstar Heroes for the Sega Genesis. Really, most run and gun shooters are pretty hype games, but I singled this one out because of how unrelenting it is in its action. Seriously, this game keeps the adrenaline at an 11 pretty much every second you're playing it. I actually feel mentally exhausted when I'm done with a session of playing this game. You're constantly shooting, hurling enemies, charging forward at a pretty good pace, and of course every enemy explodes into flames with a very satisfying sound to accompany it. The music is always very high energy as well, making good use of the unique Genesis sound chip, and simply listening to the game is like a symphony of explosions. The Genesis was marketed as a console with attitude, and I think this game is one of the best examples of that. Being made by famed developer Treasure, who became known for having great action in their games, as well as a ton of unique boss fights, which this game had plenty of. The only way to make this game any more hype is to play it cooperatively with 2 players, which is highly recommended. Next up, we've got NBA Jam. This is a game that most everybody has heard of, and was pretty much the definition of hype in the arcades, and it was popular on home consoles as well. It's the game of basketball, but reduced to 2 versus 2, and everything is way over the top. You can jump way up into the air, shove players over to steal the ball, shatter the glass on the backboard, and even light the ball and net on fire if you're playing well enough. Not to mention the announcer, who is constantly adding hype to the game, with so many different iconic catchphrases like "he's on fire" and "boom shakalaka." The game can be played with up to 4 players, and you really should if you have the opportunity. The next game is none other than Crazy Taxi. This is another game that was huge in the arcades, and had some really iconic catchphrases that the announcer would say. In this game, you basically play as a taxi driver that is completely unconcerned with any and all traffic laws in order to pick up and drop off as many passengers as fast as possible. And what's even better is that the game rewards you for driving dangerously, as the passengers will tip you extra for driving like a reckless maniac, swerving in and out of traffic and nearly hitting other cars. The gameplay is fast, frenetic, and always a blast to play. I gotta say though, I think this might actually be what they used to train taxi drivers in San Francisco. Yep, that was a joke. Alright, next up we've got Super Smash Bros., perhaps the greatest roster of characters ever in any video game. I've chosen to look at Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, although you could probably make the argument for other games in the series as well. With so many different dream matchups to choose from, the roster has almost gotten to the point where it reads like a video game Hall of Fame list. Nintendo has done a really impressive job of making deals with third parties in order to add fan favorites to the roster. Like other games on this list, the gameplay is fast and frenetic, with the appearance of absolute chaos at times, so players might get overwhelmed and lose track of what's happening. Different from a lot of other fighting games, a character's lineup of attacks is incredibly accessible, and topping it all off are the special final smash attacks that each character have. While these are typically disabled in more competitive play, they're a ton of fun to use and almost always a spectacle to watch. Okay, next up we've got another Sega Genesis game, and that would be Thunder Force 4. The levels themselves aren't always super over the top, but they are still full of quite a bit of action, and the build up to the bosses and some of the incredibly cool music really ramp up the energy in this one. The game definitely has some specific moments in it that really elevate it. It's definitely worthwhile to look up some of the music from this game, even if you never actually play it. You get some interesting weapons as well that can make you feel super powerful as you mow through enemies. Considered by many to be the best shoot 'em up of the entire 16-bit generation, if there's one game I've talked about today that I think not enough people have played, it's this one. The next game I'm going to talk about is another one that probably not a lot of people have played, and that would be Wild Guns for the Super Nintendo. Infamous for the high price tag of the original cartridge, luckily there's plenty of other ways to play it. This is actually a pretty unique style of game, often called a shooting gallery game, and while there's not a lot of them, this is the best one if you ask me. Like some of the other games on this list, blowing up stuff feels really good here. Your basic gun works well enough, but when you pick up one of the power-up guns, it gives you a huge power trip, and even better than that, if you're able to fill up your meter, you're given the special Vulcan gun that deals some serious damage and also grants you invincibility. And if all of that is still not enough, then you've also got the ability to throw dynamite back at enemies, as well as a supply of bombs that creates a very satisfying screen-clearing explosion. Or you can just use them to do a ton of damage against the bosses. Driving the fast pace of the game is some very uppity music that matches the Western theme of the game well. Alright, so that about does it for the games that I'm going to list. Of course, there's plenty of games that could fit this criteria, and that's where I'm going to leave things to you as the viewer to mention something down in the comments. Perhaps there's a game you've played that you feel belongs on this list, or maybe you just really agree with one of the choices that I put in this video. Either way, I'd love to hear what you have to say, so go ahead and leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.